Welcome, folks. Come into our virtual co-opting AI space today for a wonderful conversation that I've been eyeing to do and wanting to do for a long time and have been looking for the right people to do it. And I found them, and I'm so excited for this conversation today. Have a seat, kick back and relax. Hopefully, if you are in the Eastern time zone, you have your lunch in front of you. Hopefully sustainably sourced, maybe technically tweaked and innovated upon, which is what our panelists will be talking about today. So in that sense, it genuinely is a lunch seminar today. While you settle in, we will be continuing the series next semester. Again, I'll be talking about that as I close. I'm very excited for a couple of conversations that we've got in the pipeline. One of them is about the pipeline problem in STEM. For example, we'll be looking at hiring and gender and all of these things. I'm very, very excited for that. And with that, I think it is kind of time to get things going. So with that, I'm going to give myself the cue to welcome you all. Welcome to our last co-opting AI event in the fall 2022 semester. I hope you are all well. I take that everybody is kind of ready for the break. The holidays are ahead of you. My name is Mona Sloane. I'm a sociologist at New York University. I study technology, design, and society. I am a fellow here at the Institute for Public Knowledge, and I've been convening the Co-opting AI series since early 2019, quite a while, pre-pandemic times, if you can believe it. Now, this series would not be possible with extremely generous support from the Institute for Public Knowledge, of course, the 370J project, the Center for Responsible AI at NYU, and the Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at our engineering school here at NYU. Thank you so much for supporting the series, much appreciated. Today is the 35th event in the series, and it is dedicated to something that keeps us all alive and well because it puts food on our table, and that is agriculture. Now, before we begin our conversation, and today especially, since we will be talking about the things the soil gives us, I want to acknowledge that I am standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. And I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities on whose land you may be standing right now, and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Now, a view on agriculture makes clear that at this point, AI in almost literal ways is our bread and butter. I looked this up. Forbes claims that spending on AI technologies and solutions in agriculture is predicted to grow from $1 billion in 2020 to $4 billion in 2026. The ways in which AI is deployed in agriculture, and this is fascinating, as you will hear from our panelists today. So those technologies help to either feed us or to feed the creatures that we feed on. And those ways are really numerous, and they range from, for example, field surveillance technologies that detect animal or human breach on fields, to predictive analytics designed to help improve crop yield or control pests through real-time sensor data, including in drones, harvest automation, or food supply chain management. They also include niche applications such as computer vision technology that detects individual bees that are exposed to varying degrees of pesticides in trials. I've actually interviewed a person who runs such a business. It's fascinating. It also includes machine learning used to analyze the product structure of foods and dishes at a molecular level to then replicate it using only plant plant-based ingredients. With these developments, most of which really happen below the radar of the public, unless you dig into that, it's really hard to comprehend what is going on. With these developments come the things technologies typically bring with them: imaginations of the future, just think about the plant-based ingredients, centralization of power, and the erasure of certain but not all human laborers, among many others. And with today's event, we want to examine these developments and shed light on the social, environmental, and policy implications of the intersection between AI and agriculture. As I said, I have two very accomplished guests and experts on the panel today who both are leading on that topic. Please join me in welcoming Larissa Zimberoff and Kelly Bronson. Starting us off will be Larissa Zimberoff, who is a freelance journalist and author covering the intersection of food and technology. She has a new book out that we will put in the chat for you now. It is called Technically Food: Inside Silicon Valley's Mission to Change What We Eat. And that book covers how what we eat is rapidly changing and what startups are behind it. Her work has appeared many places, among them the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg Business Week, Wired, and The Atlantic. After working in high tech for a decade, she earned her MFA from the New School here in New York City. And today she lives in San Francisco and will gamely try any new food. Following Larissa will be Dr. Kelly Bronson, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Science and Society at the University of Ottawa in Canada. She is a social scientist studying the societal and ethical dimensions of controversial technologies and their governance, from GMOs to big data. She has published her work in national and international journals, among them Big Data and Society, the Journal of Responsible Innovation, or Science as Culture. And she also has just published a book on big data and AI and agriculture with McGill-Queen's University Press. And that book is also a fantastic book. It is called The Immaculate Conception of Data, Agribusiness, Activists, and Their Shared Politics of the Future, which we will also put in the chat for you, so you can purchase it from your independent bookstore. And with that, I'm going to be quiet now, and I will be tossing it over to Larissa for our first contribution. Thank you both for being here, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you so much, Mona. This is so fun. I love to see a women-only panel. It's great. And especially to talk about the food we eat. I'm going to share my screen for some brief slides. But first, a little about myself. I am, as you said, a freelance journalist, and the book that I wrote, Technically Food, came to me because I felt this urgency to talk about what we were possibly going to be eating, what we may already be eating, and what that means for our health. Now, what I love about this panel is we're really not talking about that topic, and it kind of frees me up to think about what's happening in a different way, this data and how decisions are being made, because it's never about our health, actually, infrequently about our health. And so I wrote my book from a health perspective. I have type 1 diabetes, and I have to think about what I eat. So kale grown in a vertical farm is very different from kale grown in a field, because the fiber content is radically different. Fiber is what most of us are missing from our diet. Fiber is what helps me equalize my blood sugar easier, simpler, makes my life easier, simpler. And it's that that need that I have day to day about eating and living and thriving that drove me to write this book. But I'm excited about talking about data and agriculture solely. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go to there. And there we go. So you guys know that. This is where to find me, which Mona mentioned. Also, if you want to jot down my Twitter and Instagram, my newsletter I send out every other week, and my email address if you want to contact me, I'll throw it into the chat at the end. I'm also on TikTok for anybody who loves TikTok like me. I do goofy videos about making food with weird ingredients because like Mona said, I will gamely try anything. There's the cover of my book. And so my thoughts for this intro is real brief because I think that our conversation is going to be more interesting, but I thought I would mention just some of the bigger players that are out there. Plenty, which is located close to me in the Bay Area. They're also in my book. They are opening up actually their Compton farm very, very soon. So it's interesting that I live in California, which is, you know, the basket of all agriculture. We are supplying the rest of the country with fruits and vegetables, but yet we have these giant mega farms that are going in indoors to get us foods. There's Aero Farms, which is on the East Coast in Newark, also in my book. And you can see Plenty has achieved almost $1 billion in revenue, apologies, in investment. Revenue is almost laughable for most of these companies, but Aero Farms is in Newark, and they've been around for almost 13 years and are still, like, I would say, getting off the ground. Gotham Greens just opened up a 10-acre farm right near UC Davis. Gotham Greens started on the rooftop of Whole Foods in Gowanus, New York. And now they're opening a 10-acre farm. Now theirs is an indoor farm, not a vertical farm. Vertical farms typically use potting soil and use LED lights. Indoor farms are much like, you know, the Netherlands, which are very much ahead of the curve on the growing indoors. So, but the fact that they're opening up in California is very interesting. And they say that they're selling out every day. Although I have to admit that I saw basil in the market. It was Whole Foods. So I saw basil from Gotham Greens in Whole Foods, and none of it looked good to buy. So it's interesting that they are still trying so hard. So we've got Unfold, which is a seed company, Calera, also a seed company. Both these companies are working on seeds for vertical farms specifically. Freight Farms is selling farms and shipping containers to people, which means everyone is dependent upon that company to get their farm off the ground. Agricool, which is in Europe, One Farm, Upward Farms. There's so many more, and these are just a few. And then the investment, as I mentioned, I think Plenty is very interesting. They have one farm now, soon to have their second, but that's it. You can't find their greens very many places. They've been around also for over 10 years. And it's just what my book mostly pointed out was that it was going to be very hard for these farms to become an actual revenue generating farm. They need robots, they need sensors, they need highly paid, highly skilled engineers, you know, from Tesla. And, you know, how are they going to continue that? And then they seem to think they're going to get some cookie cutter application where each subsequent farm becomes easier, but that's not the case so far. App Harvest is an indoor farm, not a vertical farm. They're growing tomatoes in like Kentucky and the Appalachian Mountains, and they went public with a SPAC deal. Their stock is currently trading at 88 cents, but they managed to raise $475 million. The beauty of a SPAC deal for them is that they can go beyond investors, but that means the general public is, you know, putting their money into these things. Gotham Greens has raised $440 million. The amount of money in vertical farms is extraordinary. So what are they tracking? I don't even think I've got the whole list here, but light, temperature, moisture, heat, spectrum, soil, growth, fruit size, bricks, which is the sweetness, which is more like the tomatoes, nutrient levels, gases, speed to harvest, water use, pathogens, crop conditions, leaf quality, moisture retention, flavor, taste, yield, tooth packing, which means how much is left in your teeth after you eat the greens. I can attest to greens definitely staying in my teeth, and then shelf life. That's 23 items that's data that is collected and that can be used, and that can be, like we will probably talk later, how that might be, stacking the bar against certain people that don't have access to that data or don't know how to use that data, don't want to pay for that data, are we entering a world where farmers have to have this 23 points of data on every single thing they grow? If I'm missing something, send it to me in the chat. Sorry. Okay, so the promises, just grab some quotes that I've seen in the media about what the promises of vertical farms are, because that's my focus, my expertise. That's, generally where I go, but we will talk about different agriculture ideas. So vertical farm strength lie in its high productivity and its potential to diversify how and where food is produced. Now this how and where food is produced, we'll get back to, but which can promote resilience in our food systems. Another quote, that they're going to localize, that they're going to be hyper local, that they're going to cut back on transportation costs. Now, I mentioned Arrow Farms, which is in Newark, New Jersey. They just announced that they will be in all Whole Foods locations across the country. That doesn't sound hyper local to me. That sounds like a lot of transportation. It sounds like they're sending greens to California, where we already have greens. So I'm ending my short presentation with seeds, because it's like owning the seeds once again. So recently, Bayer, which bought Monsanto, invested $30 million in Unfold. Unfold is creating seeds for vertical farms. And why would they invest in Unfold? Because they want to own the seeds. And this is, we've already seen, problematic to farmers. So it's really interesting. And then I have highlighted some things that I think are really, how they're sort of selling the vision. They're to create an accessible and sustainable food ecosystem. It's a foundation to address the biggest food challenges facing our world. Again, we've been down this road before. We haven't seen agriculture become more equitable or fair. We haven't seen more diversity in crops, and we are potentially going down a similar road with food tech and ag tech and vertical farms, and they may not even bring us more diversity. They may just bring us the same expensive greens that we have now. Anyways, so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mona to introduce Kelly and for Kelly's presentation and then our conversation.
Thank you so much, Larissa. Much appreciated. I was glued to your lips and to what you showed us on the screen. Kelly, over to you. Larissa, if you could stop sharing your screen. Yes. And Kelly can take over. Meanwhile, dear audience, if you have questions for our panelists for the discussion, please pop them into the Q&A box that you see at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. We will be getting to that after the two provocations from our panelists. Kelly, over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Larissa. That was so interesting. And thanks, Mona, and all the folks at Co-opting AI for having us here for this conversation on co-opting AI in agriculture, which, as you said, Mona, kind of flies below the radar. It's I often say to people, I feel like I'm in the midst of one of the hottest conversations around AI and society, trying to talk about farmers and tractors, and I'm sort of in the most minor of conversations within the hottest topic. But I think that will change. So as Mona said, I have a newly published book, and I'm going to draw from that book today. And the book kind of operates at two levels, and it's always difficult to say anything meaningful in eight minutes. And I didn't know which level to draw on. So I'm going to talk about both, or tell you what the two levels are, but focus on the second. So on the one hand, the book was my attempt to bring to the light or the surface this thing that is not often thought about, which is, what are the practices around data collection and aggregation into big data sets, and the use of algorithms, or in the case of food production, they're called decision support platforms in food production and agriculture. So the book started out for me in 2017 as I wanted to figure out what folks were doing in this space, data scientists, computer scientists, and farmers. because they are in this space. So this is a screen capture from the maker of the big green tractor, John Deere, that gives you a sense of the variety of digital tools that are being used, all to generate what they call precision in food production. So precise management of inputs like seeds and chemicals, and advice that the companies, at least the commercial offers from John Deere and Monsanto or Bayer Monsanto, they charge farmers then for advice generated from predictive analytics, machine learning. So partly the book was my attempt to figure out what folks were doing in the context of agriculture with big data and with AI. And I was really following, I stand on the shoulders of giants, from folks who have unveiled concerns, I would say social justice concerns, around the uses and misuses of big data and algorithms in other contexts, like criminal justice or like employment. And I'm thinking here of Virginia Eubanks, for example, or Sophia Noble. So I sort of thought, what's going on in agriculture, and perhaps, there's reason to be concerned. I had studied genetically modified organisms, and Larissa mentioned, right, seed ownership and patenting. And I had talked for years about the somewhat problematic legal infrastructure around seeds. And I wondered if big data and proprietary algorithms followed in some of these patterns. We won't get into that, but so that was like what I set out to do in the book. I would say, just quickly, figuring out what was being done with data was not super easy for me. And in part, it's because the science, so the scientists and what they're able to say, at least those working in the private sector, as well as the data sets themselves and the algorithms, are proprietary. Or they're protected by a variety of legal mechanisms. So intellectual property law, copyright law, and then in the case of people who could say things, meaningful things, by trade secrecy law. They're what Frank Pascal calls a pernicious black box, or I found them to be. So that's sort of a finding in and of itself, I think, related to co-opting AI. But I nonetheless kind of marched on in my methodological process, and I had to get creative. So I participated in webinars for some of these decision support platforms, or AI for farmers, as if I were a farmer. I didn't ever lie, but I behaved as if I were a farmer. Which is interesting, actually, thinking of AI and targeted advertising. I started to get advertisements aimed at farmers, including dating sites, even though I'm married. My partner was not super pleased. So I participated in webinars. I read farm newspapers and trade journals. I went to conventions focused on agriculture, but again, because this flies below the radar, mostly it was just general AI and big data conventions. I read financial reporting, investment reports, and drawing on all of this, I was able to make some claims about what people are doing with AI, and then for whose benefit, right, or who is disserved potentially by algorithmic practices in the context of food. And I won't spend time on this today. I've published this, including in really accessible articles, like accessible as in 850 words and readable, this piece for the conversation. I did want to just mention one thing, which is that, after all of this kind of sleuthing, I did come to the reasonable claim that I really believe we ought to start seeing companies like John Deere and like Monsanto, or now Bayer Monsanto, as data companies, as big tech. So I said to my publisher at some point, I really think the tagline for my book should be "Seeing Monsanto as the New Facebook." And we should interrogate these companies in the same way we are, at least now, somewhat, right, both legally and in terms of social activism, interrogating Silicon Valley big tech. And partly, and I just wanted to mention this one implication, because actually this is something that I was able to spot using what Ian Bogost, the communications scholar, calls the procedural rhetoric of algorithms. So like, I wasn't able to peek behind the algorithms or really know how they generate advice for farmers, right? What the data sets that feed AI, how they're configured exactly. But even just looking at the surface, basically it's a superficial or superficial kind of assessment or analysis. But even doing that, I was able to see that kind of like in other sectors like social media, right, or search algorithms, we can see a really notable bias in agricultural big data and algorithms. And here's just one, which is that companies, the commercial offers in terms of these predictive analytical tools that generate advice for farmers, they only collect data on a small selection of what we call agronomic crops in food studies or in agriculture, corn, soy, right? And these are crops grown on large acreages among farmers who, all farmers have a hard gig. So I'm not saying that farmers are powerful, but farmer to farmer, right? These are the powerful farmers. These are the corporate farmers. They farm on more land and they have more access to capital. One CEO I interviewed said, well, of course, right? They're our bread and butter. Of course, we're designing tools for these farmers, but there's a host of reasons why we ought to be worried, I think, from both a social justice and environmental justice perspective, that increasingly the data are being collected only or biased, right, or skewed toward this particular landscape or conversion of nature into food. Okay, but today I wanted to focus on the second level at which the book operates, because it was surprising to me, and I think it might surprise you. The book is really also about practices of imagination. So practices of thinking habits, but also speech habits, most importantly, habits of speech that I found to be pervasive. I found to be ideologically flexible or versatile, and I'm going to go into an example of what I mean by that, and actually which exceed agriculture. So even though my book is about big data and AI in agriculture, this framework that I develop in the book, and in fact, it takes pride and place in the title of my book, is actually one that I think hopefully you'll start to notice far exceeds the domain of food production. It circulates more widely. Okay, when I set out to write the book, as I said, I really set out to write a book just about describing what was being done with big data and AI, thinking about some of the possible social and environmental justice implications of data uses, potential misuses. And I had this pretty simple research design where I was going to interview folks, mostly scientists and engineers working in private sector, and then in the public sector, because I had known and published on groups of activist farmers who were kind of playing in this big data space. And I thought I had this pretty simple science and technology studies, which was my home field, research design, right? It was going to be like a social construction of technology project. I was going to interview, thinking about what might be the differences in the values and the culture in these two domains of science, and how might that be materializing into these different models for the realization of what is sometimes called digital agriculture or agriculture 4.0, which is really interesting, coming back to this framework, which I'll describe. So on one level, I did find differences. So, I interviewed folks in the private sector where one CEO told me, what we do is we are developing AI for good farmers. And then when I said, or he said successful farmers, sorry. And when I said, what's a successful farmer? And he said, oh, a farmer that gets big and grows corn. Coming back to that previous point about bias. So there's a particular vision of the future of agriculture under big data and AI held by the folks working in the private sector. And it's that large scale, in food studies, we call it productivist, right? It's facing the global marketplace, growing commodities, input intensive, including chemicals. Also, though, in this context, there's a whole different relationship or a specific relationship to data. So data are, as I said before, right, proprietary to the data sets. The algorithms are protected by copyright law and intellectual property, but agreements. And interestingly, one source of data or evidence I used was I read those license and use agreements, and privacy and the protection of farmer privacy is really clearly used. I don't want to say weaponized, that's a bit cynical or overstated, but it's, this approach to data is really justified by private industry as a means to protect farmer privacy, which if you're a big corporate farmer, maybe you have trade secrets of your own, and that's legitimate. And then a different approach to innovation. So from the activists. So, the activists that I engaged with who make do-it-yourself and open tools, open data, open innovation. They develop platform decision predictive analytics in an open capacity, right? Mostly with volunteer coding. Folks who work in Silicon Valley and their full-time work off time to code this platform. One I'm thinking of is called Farm OS, and they do it all on GitHub. So a totally different approach to data, right? Open to innovation, and also a completely different ethos around agriculture. So these folks are really interested in supporting agriculture that's community facing, motivated by kind of collective action frames like food sovereignty, and enlisting farmer help, right? And developing tools in an open and kind of farmer-led or farmer feedback capacity. Okay. So after 2 years, I did see these differences. Oh, sorry. One thing I had on the previous slide was despite their differences, these differences in kind of visions of the future of agriculture, visions of good technology and good data management, all of the players that I interacted with talked about big data and AI as the route to the future of farming, despite their divergent images of what that future would look like. So they shared a faith in these tools as getting us to this future. But it was also that I was struck by the fact that everyone described data as if it dropped from the sky, or maybe as if it were a natural resource pulled from the ground, right? Unmediated by humans. They described AI fed by big data as agential and able to affect change towards some perfected future. And last, the quote unquote data driven, which was a very common phrasing, future that they talked about was described as inevitable. So a kind of deterministic, we might call it, approach to technology and social change. So other scholars have talked about cultural fantasies around data and AI, similar to what I'm describing as the Immaculate Conception of Data. So I'm thinking of folks like Ian Bogost, who in the Cathedral of Computation, which was an article in The Atlantic a long time ago now, talked about our near religious faith in algorithmic logic. Kate Crawford, well-known Kate Crawford, talks about data fundamentalism. But in the book, I treat this framework, again, that I spotted empirically after years and years of field work, I treated it not as a distorted epistemic view, right, of religious as opposed to rational view. And I don't treat it as a failed kind of heuristic, but rather as strategic. I came to see that it was really clever of people to be leveraging this framework because it garnered them support for their particular technological projects, right? In their bid to change the future of agriculture in these very different ways, mind you. Everyone, it seemed, was enlisting this immaculate conception of data. And I came to see that it was a pretty winning strategy. And in the book, I tell stories about how I came to see that it worked to garner support, whether it was funding, my support as a social scientist, interviewing someone in a field. And so what I do in the book is I try to not just describe this framework and its presence, but explain it. And so I draw on a history of scholarship, of theorizing within science and technology studies that talks about the relationship between technology and values, we might call it, right? And that has done a great job of detailing how those who have been able to describe technology as value-free or scientific knowledge making as disinterested, in Robert Merton's phrase, and those who have been able to speak scientific truths, like the scientist, right, or the technocrat, have been able to use that as a rhetorical device to win support for socio-technical initiatives. I'm thinking in the book, I talk about colonialism, and I draw a slide here with an image from early industrialism. So with the Immaculate Conception of Data, I try not to just describe its existence, but also describe its social force. Okay, by calling on this STS scholarship, for which, technology as value 3 is a kind of a shop-worn figure in STS by this point. But I also, of course, but I also pull on multiple cultural threads, and I don't have time to go into really very many of them, but including most obviously Christian doctrine. And so what certain audiences, I gave a talk at a public library last week to folks mostly in their 70s, and they loved the title because it's like riff on Catholicism and the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Jesus. And I did that consciously because, right, the Immaculate Conception of Jesus, talking about Mary's conception of Jesus and her cleanliness, right, not just confers power on Mary, of course, Hail Mary, full of grace, right, but also on God, right? Again, it comes back to what Donna Haraway calls the God's eye trick, right? If you know the truth, right, then you are in a powerful position. If you speak of that truth, if you speak of a technology as better than human decision making, and better because it's divorced from politics and values and interests, which is the core of the Immaculate Conception of Data, then you have a really powerful strategy. So here are just a few examples. So these long-standing cultural ideas or ideals around technology, neutrality, and power find expression, right, in Tim. So this is an agribusiness exec who said to me, the human reading of data is not scalable, and it doesn't play into the bigger picture. You know, if the system sees the viral plant, his AI system, a weed detecting algorithm, it sees all the viral plants, and it just knows, right? So people describe their technologies as smart, or a late afternoon coffee with a public sector data scientist and mapper in her near windowless office in the Canadian Government Agriculture Building. You know, Hannah told me, I now know everything, or we know every field, what's going on in it. It could be about the soil. And Larissa talked about some of in indoor agricultural context, some of the things that sensors and predictive analytics focus on. It's very similar in farming. It's really powerful, she told me, just to know. There's one article that I analyzed in the book from a trade newspaper that says weather monitoring with AI is knowing. It's less guessing and knowing. And to be and kind of like what Larissa does with her book, in my book, I look at some of the claims made by businesses, and I actually trace them into the farm field to talk about how they get taken up or not by farmers. Okay, despite its usefulness, the ultimate argument I make in the book, and this is where I'm going to leave you with my provocation, is that Immaculate Conception of Data is hazardous in the Leo Marx sense. Does everyone know that essay, 1996, Technology, a Hazardous Concept? It's such a great essay. It's a hazardous way of imagining and describing what big data and what algorithms are and the relationship with society or social forces. It's dangerous because it obfuscates. It makes less visible, right, political economies, and Larissa was getting at some of that. And this is how the two levels of the book interact, right? I talk about some of those problematic political economies that for years have directed our food system. So folks might not know, but agribusinesses like the chemical and seed companies are the oldest oligopoly companies they were big tech, before what we now think of, before Google, Apple, and Amazon, and Facebook. And so ICD obfuscates us from looking at these political economies and these moral orderings that have come to define food systems and the everyday lives of lots of people, including farmers. And so ICD, right, is a conceptual, I would say, force that's quietly aiding and stabilizing these historic relationships of power. So I started the book wanting to just describe what was happening with big data, and then it became a kind of like, you know, meta level inquiry into why aren't people concerned about this? Why aren't other people describing this? And I came to see that this Immaculate Conception of Data, or I argue, is one of the things that's perhaps keeping us quiet, or making agricultural big data, not making, that's too forceful, but helping it go below the radar, as Mona said, because, right, it closes down the exact and precise lines of inquiry we need to co-opt AI. Who wrote this AI, right? Who stands to gain from its use? On which variables are data collected? Why these variables, not others? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you so much, Larissa, for your terrific contributions. Dear audience, please, if you have questions for our wonderful panelists, please start putting them into the Q&A. But before it is your turn, it is mine. And I have a bunch of questions for our panelists. And so I want to start with something that we kind of touched upon briefly when we got together before we opened the doors to the public, which was method, and kind of the kinds of interrogations that we need. And Kelly, you just so beautifully ended on that. And so my question for both of you is, what are your methods of cracking open the black box of AI-driven agriculture? And I mean, not just with regards to the AI, right? We talk a lot about the black box problem, and tech is complicated. We need all these highly trained people who are specialists who can explain this very complex technology to us lay people. That's not necessarily what I mean. What I mean is, it seems that agriculture in some ways, and Kelly, or both of you have talked about this, has always kind of been removed or moved further away from our everyday life. And so it seems that the distance between our everyday life and those in agriculture that actually, those processes and people that feed us, that is kind of a black box. So I wonder how both of you address that. How do you open up the black box, not just of AI, but of ag tech specifically? Larissa, if you could start off.
Starting deep. It's funny, in my book, I joke that one of the founders of AeroFarms said he wouldn't show me his algorithms. So this and that tour was probably from 2018. So, I've been attempting to get data from these companies for a very long time. I wanted to know if these foods were as nutritious as leafy greens grown in soil and in outdoors. And I never did get anything shared with me. So it is, as a journalist, right? Kelly and I come at it from very different places. As a journalist, I ask a lot of questions. Often I'm told I ask too many questions. I'm told I'm digging for dirt, which is a good pun with the soil and farming. And I don't get every question answered. So it's a matter of talking to more people. It's trying to write the articles that go deeper than other articles. I recently presented at the Berkeley Haas School, and the only thing I talked about was how food tech was being featured in the media and what questions weren't being asked and how things were presented, what headlines were used, the Wall Street Journal just did a big article about Ethan Brown and Beyond Meat and how, unfortunately, it's not doing well right now, and using that as the claim that plant-based isn't doing well. And, there were questions that weren't asked, and we're talking about the Wall Street Journal. So I think that for some reason, like Kelly and you have both said, it's under the radar and we're not bringing it to light. And data, even if we look at Google and Facebook, we don't know what they're doing, but we want to know what they're doing. If we think about farm to table and transparency, right, that sort of was coming to our food system. And now what I think is it's getting more and more obfuscated by things like data, by things that other people are filtering for us, by the discrepancy between peas and pea protein isolate that is created to create new foods. I think that how do I get to the bottom of it? How do I break it open? It's that I am extremely skeptical and critical, and I ask as many questions as I can. And the companies that won't answer my questions, I tend to not want to write about. So.
Great. Yeah. That was great. And a really great question. I just yesterday, and I teach a sociology of food class. And so I read this and I brought it to my social food undergrads, a study in North America that showed some really, I forget the ridiculously high percentage of school kids thought bacon came from plants. So there's this point about, most of us, at least in North America, being quite disconnected from farming. Right now is it's part of, I think, the problem because there's a presumption about what farming is, and it doesn't really match the reality of what's happening on the ground. And it allows for, things to fly under the radar. So part of it is, creating a kind of knowledge about the food system and who the players are in the food system and what are some of the inequities, right? Because the players that have sold farmers technologies from hybrid seeds to GMOs to now big data and AI, they've become really powerful in the sale of those technologies and used really the promotion of technologies to control farmers through indebtedness and the technology treadmill. We don't have time for a food studies lesson. So I think it's partly like a food studies thing and awareness. And then for access, we spoke about it behind the scenes before this began. For everyone out there, I mean, I kind of said it, I had a lot of trouble figuring out what was going on. Partly because I had published critically on GMOs, not on the technology per se, but on their legal infrastructure and the ways they limited farmers and farm relationships. But I published enough that was interpreted critically that folks at, the big agribusinesses were really hesitant to talk to me. So mostly I got like the stakeholder relations person. But even then I turned that into a finding in and of itself, right? Because I heard the same story. And in fact, one stakeholder relations person for an unnamed, anonymized big agribusiness said, my job is to tell the sustainability story. And I thought that's so interesting, right? Like it's a story, it's a pitch. It's very much the Silicon Valley, right? Even among like seed and chemical companies approach to technology and winning support for technologies. But I would say, how are we going to come to know, apart from folks like Larissa asking really good questions? I'm subject to ethical guides at the university that prevented me from doing the kind of sleuthing that I probably wanted to do. I asked one of my students, find me interviewees, and he said, I'm going into the deep web. And all I said to him was, don't do anything illegal. Remember our legal. But I think that I suspect that it's going to come with activism. Right? The only reason we really know what's happening with our personal data harvested like breadcrumbs online is because of whistleblowers and activists. And I think it's going to be worked out in the court of public opinion. So I think we need to support activists who are engaging in some of this sleuthing around agricultural big data, which is mostly happening in the global South, and then support legal activists. So we really need to think about how we can use some of those same tools that industry is using, like privacy, but also competition law, to force companies to be a bit more, well, at least transparent about what they're doing and for whom.
And I'm just going to chime an ending to that, which is that one of my fears is that this wide swath of vertical farms, for example, just that one category, will not be able to survive and will be swallowed up by big ag of today, of yesterday, right? And will become even harder for activists to get clout with, because they know how to operate and they know how to like push back activism. So, I actually just got an article today about AppHarvest, and they say they might have to close or radically shift what they're doing because they can't make enough money and they're just burning through money. And that is because they need robots and data, because they need algorithms, because they need AI, computer sensors and computer vision. They can't just grow greens and make money and be a profitable company. And so these bigger companies, the companies we may not trust as much, are going to come in and there'll be consolidation that might be more worrisome than today.
Which is interesting because that kind of shows how the narratives, Kelly, that you spoke about also kind of work to consolidate some of these power structures over time. I have a question that ties into a question we got from the audience. Reese Alger has a question that I also had, which was about the relationship between public and private that you both spoke about in different ways. And more questions are always welcome, dear audience. So my question is about how does the introduction of AI, the Immaculate Conception of Data, food startups or ag tech startups, how does that change the relationship between publicness and privateness, between public entities and private entities generally, and especially in the food sector? But we have a question that is about the sharing of data, and says, I've heard a common narrative that farmers are very reluctant to share data about their farms. what is the experience of the speakers around this? What are the incentives successfully used to incentivize farmers to hand over their data? What is the benefit? What is the benefits farmers are sold? How does this sold value manifest as realized value or not? And we may tag on to, you can interpret this question either as a kind of for-profit commercial one or a community-focused one. So
I've just been interviewing like an electric autonomous tractor company, a bunch of different companies out here in California, and the data isn't the farmers. So they don't have that choice. I can't say 100%, but they have to buy in to the data. So the new structure for farmers, and why it's only the big farmers that may be able to afford the John Deere, $1 million tractor, is that they're going to need money to also buy the data. So this tractor company, this autonomous tractor company, is going to sell the tractor for $70,000, but they're also going to sell a monthly subscription to the data that they pick up from cameras on the tractor. The farmer doesn't own the data, so
you don't even own the tractor. The whole right to repair movement has made this visible, that, there's a big issue where farmers can't repair their own tractors, the John Deere tractor, because of an interpretation of copyright law, where the tractor, just like everyone's cell phone, right, is, well, depending on your cell phone, it's licensed. And so, the farmers don't own the data. They have to pay for usable data. They pay for the equipment that collects the data, and the data gets sent via cloud infrastructure to the company that aggregates it. And then those data sets themselves are a source of revenue or value for the company, just like we see with Facebook, for example. That's the political economy, right, of our online environment now. And then the farmers also pay for the advice generated via those big data sets and AI. So with John Deere, they pay into a My Farm Manager app. So if they want advice directed from the AI or the predictive analytics, they pay for that. They pay with their data, arguably. They pay to access the data. They pay for the equipment. So farmers pay quite a bit, which makes it actually quite dissimilar to the context of social media, where we pay with our data, but everything else is quote unquote free, free participation in the platform. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Larissa. I just think that's
no. I'm so glad you made that point.
Okay, it's really surprising, I think, to people when it's like, no, the farmer doesn't even technically own it, right? It's licensed because it's no longer a mechanical vehicle.
And then what farmer can take the data and make something from it? So then they have to take data that's already structured in a way that's already given to them, saying a certain thing, whatever that thing is. Farmers, or are farmers going to be expected to hire some data scientist that's in the barn, right? That's not going to happen. So who's translating the data?
I found in the book too, interestingly, that the big corporate farmers that are buying into the higher order, the AI, they actually very much buy into or interpolate it into the messaging from the industry that says, it was on my slide of the differences, right? Leave the data science to us, you're busy. And the farmers very much said that, right? We're managers, we're a corporate entity ourselves, and they're very happy actually which comes to the question about trust and data. I found a separation between, the farmers paying into these systems, that they seem to trust the companies. They don't trust the government. One farmer said to me, I'm worried about Big Brother getting access to these data sets. They trust the seed and chemical companies, in part because these very powerful companies have courted these relationships of, I said dependence before, but with farmers, right, over 70 years. If you're a deer man, not to be sexist, but right, then you're a deer man, and there's a whole culture around it. So I didn't find the privacy concerns around, or the sharing concerns around those farmers, but for sure around the activist farmers, there's some concern, but more so actually, it was just an enthusiasm for open data. And then the success of the tools is a whole other thing. I have a paper coming out in Nature, hopefully soon, on that. There hasn't been a whole lot of study about testing the validity of these algorithms around the sustainability or productivity claims. And then the public-private, I feel like, is a separate question too. But Mona, I think you have another question for us.
Yeah, so I just want to, so we have an audience member, Lynn Ripley, who said they've been interviewing farmers for about 6 years and found reluctance among farmers to participate in data collection by companies such as John Deere. in that those farmers were really bothered by the secrecy surrounding that data collection and data ownership. And there were questions around who was actually benefiting from that. So just leaving that note here, I have another one, which is about power before we get to another topic. And again, audience members are more than welcome to add their questions to the Q&A box. So Jurong Soon has a question about any shifts of power in the industry via the application of this new technology that you can observe, and I assume in one direction or the other. If any, do you think this pattern of power shifting is unique to this digital age and is different from the old-time technology revolutions, for example, the industrial revolutions? In other words, is this a whole new beast that we're dealing with, or is this more of the same, Larissa?
Yeah, the one area that I can speak to that I think answers this question a little bit is that most companies, most startups I talk to eventually get to a point in their growth and development where they want to hire big food people. So people that have experience, right, in the old food system. And that's sort of the way they go. But now I'm seeing like Impossible Foods and people leaving Impossible Foods and becoming that big food, because Impossible could be looked at as, an old timer at this point because they have done so well, because they have grown so big, because you can get their burger everywhere. So now if you've worked at Impossible, it's sort of like you're big food adjacent. And so those employees, those CEOs, COOs, CTOs are going elsewhere. And I'm seeing those people bouncing from job to job to job, which means that the ecosystem is very tight and not as diverse as we might want it.
I think that's a great question. One of the cultural threads that I think the Immaculate Conception of Data pulls on is a lot of the kind of promissory rhetoric around the early internet, right? As a disruptive technology, as an emancipatory one, right? Internet for democracy. And just in the case of the internet or ICTs, right, these technologies, I think, do hold that potential on some level, right? So, with ICTs and the cell phone, we can film, everyday people become kind of vigilant and can film, for example, police brutality. And like there are emancipatory elements. And certainly the activists playing in this space of big data, AI, and agriculture, they very much see this, right? That these technologies, especially if they're generated in open contexts of production with open data, they're going to help as part of this. I called it like a social movement almost, right? Emancipate. And I think that potential is there, right? But there's good reason, I think, to be cautious about thinking that what's happening in agriculture is revolutionary. So widely, this is called the digital revolution in food and agriculture. And I think that's irresponsible, like the ICD framework. Carolyn Marvin has this great book, When Old Technologies Are New. I think one of the most radical things we can do is ask what stays the same. Right. So while these tools are technically new, right, this isn't a notebook and a pen or even a computer Excel spreadsheet for a farmer. This is, right, predictive analytics and AI. Likely they generate some, optimization or precise advice for farmers. Maybe these tools, if used and developed by activists, hold emancipatory potential. But I think there's a real asymmetry between the companies and the activists, right? The activists are mostly volunteer. And the companies, there's a huge history of consolidation, oligopoly market power, and just enthusiasm around that, the realization of that model of digital agriculture and the status quo, right, of relationships of inequity in our food system. So I try to remain somewhat symmetrical or hold out promise for the disruptive potential of these tools vis-a-vis democracy, but I think there's really good reason to think we need to be cautious about the reproduction of power.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. There is a lot of talk, and there has been a lot of talk about AI ethics and sort of responsible technology. We're seeing a lot of regulation popping up. We're all anticipating the big EU AI Act that's going to kick in probably in the spring of 23. I wonder, does any of the regulatory discourse kind of pay specific attention to agriculture in the same way in which it does, for example, to the automotive industry and autonomous driving? That's my first question. And the second question I have relatedly, or somewhat related to this, are there educational offerings that you know of in universities or as training that addresses data science for agriculture or even responsible AI for agriculture, any of that sort? So the folks that you interview, and Larissa, you especially talking to the startup kids, where do they get their training, and does this training actually include kind of an ethical societal component? So regulation and training, two questions.
Yeah. Well, one thing they try to do is hire people who have worked at regulatory agencies, right? So they usually hire lawyers first, and then someone that's worked at a regulatory agency. And I don't know if we could go to cultured meat, which is, could be called synthetic agriculture because it is recreating animal cells. Upside Foods recently received a no questions letter from the FDA, and that is because their head of regulatory is from a former FDA person, former USDA person. So they received the first letter in the US to basically say that their chicken, their cell-based chicken, is safe to eat. This chicken has been deemed safe to eat purely by Upside Foods statements. Right. So this is, again, sort of, we can point this to data, which is that we're trusting someone's data, purely trusting their data to say that it's safe to eat. I'm not so sure that makes me feel safe, but apparently it's good enough for the FDA. So educational offerings is not an area that I can speak to about data. I don't hear ethical concerns brought up very frequently in my conversations with startups. It's always, mission-based. It's about recreating animals without the animal. It's saving the planet. And they are so confident in this this project that they don't seem to dig deeper and make sure that they're, one of the things that I'm concerned about is that our food system is creating an unhealthy world. And if future food and food tech doesn't change that, then we will just, it will just continue. We will continue to become an unhealthier population, eating more processed foods. And this is one of the big topics of my book. And so it is concerning. I do think that academia is the most exciting place for food, for data, to be talking about these questions. And I'm excited to see so many conversations happening and papers being written by Kelly. And I think that's our best bet is academia, and it's the next generations, the next 2 generations.
Yeah, thanks. Those are such great questions. I think my short answer to is there regulation either at the national level or, in terms of these like large charters on AI and responsibility that address agriculture specifically? No. The short answer is no. And so actually I'm sort of moving reluctantly into the AI governance space and the data governance space, because I really think someone ought to be having that conversation. I've been trying to connect with a group in Canada that's basically been given AI regulation, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. I keep saying you need to look at agriculture, but again, I feel like I'm trying to have a conversation that is thought to be maybe irrelevant, or it's not on the radar, or maybe even a little bit boring, right? In part because of presumptions about farming, perhaps as folksy and parochial and not a space for big tech, or not seeing the Monsantos as the emerging Facebooks. But so no, I think is the answer to that question. And then for pedagogy, I mean, Mona, you teach like you're doing great work, and you're right though that even, not even, but the courses that try to introduce engineers to ethical thinking or responsible research and innovation frameworks, I haven't seen many courses or subtopics within courses syllabi that focus on agriculture. So, and thanks Larissa for that shout out, but I teach social scientists. Who really needs to maybe hear these things are the data scientists and the engineers. And so maybe this is a future project.
I love that. Thank you for that. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure that we get in the other questions from the audience. There is one question I want to ask before I turn to the big elephant in the room, I think, which is the climate emergency, but let's hold that for a second. We have a question from Diana Minstein, who is asking, is there a spatial dimension to the adoption of these tools? For example, Vermont versus Iowa in the context of the US specifically. In other words, are there particular social, economic, political, and environmental conditions that enable these kinds of trends that you described?
You have someone you want to go first? Larissa?
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, I would say, before I said that the tools based on like which data are being collected are really only suitable to a particular kind of grower that I called a relatively powerful or corporate farmer growing commodities for the international market. I've published on this, but I would say also the cost of the tools, but also the land, the relationship between the technology design and what the land looks like really only mean that the tools that use the AI, the decision support platforms, and what's called variable rate application of things like water and chemicals and fertilizer, they only make sense for flat tracts of land where turnaround at the edges of the field is easier, right? They only make sense from a farmer's perspective in terms of return on investment if you're managing thousands of acres. Because like the precision that they promise, right, the advantages only really accumulate over thousands of acres. So kind of by design, right, technology design, the tools only make sense for not only the large scale farmers with access to capital, but really farmers, I would say, in the Midwest of North America or similar farms. I'm talking, the variable rate tools and precision equipment coming from John Deere and that the decision platforms offered by Bayer Monsanto, for example. There are smaller scale tools. There are tools for horticulturalists and for vineyards, and there's, robotic milking machines, but the largest agribusinesses, coming back to power, and the largest commercial offerings are really only suitable or make sense. So there is that specificity, I would say, in answer to that question.
And I would say that it's investment, just like my book title, Silicon Valley is trying to change what we eat, and it's their money that is changing what we're doing. And it's their money that's allowing data to become so important. Once Beyond Meat went public, Wall Street began to pay attention. So now we have both Silicon Valley private investors and we have the public sphere investing and making these companies so astronomically big just in their bank account, briefly. And that is, they have to have all those roles. If they don't have those data scientists, if they don't have those engineers, then what is their reason for being? If they don't require fewer humans and more robots. So the structure is so dependent on the financial wins that they can get based on their technology. Then we're like, I don't know, we're failing, we're going backwards. We're like thinking about farmers in the soil, right? Unless we're thinking big, we are not thinking at all. There's a company that's, basically planning to mine all the plants to find different compounds to make cheese. And the guy that started the company comes from Google and is a data scientist. And, he is now going to be making the cheese we eat. That's what's happening with data. It's because they're becoming food makers.
What a great term. Kind of to segue into the elephant in the room that I just kind of mentioned, which is what I would love to close on. And in any Schoenberger in the audience has posted a question I would have also asked, which is, are you concerned about farmers needing to buy into data around climate change in order to adapt their farms? Is this conversation happening at all? And I'm just going to add my question to that, which is, what does all of this mean vis-a-vis the climate emergency? And Kelly, maybe we'll start with you and then Larissa.
Sure. Yeah, that is the elephant in the room. So this paper that isn't out yet, so I really shouldn't talk about it, speaking of responsibility, but is basically a meta review of the technical literature, looking for evidence of the claims, both by the companies, but also by academics around sustainability. So I didn't get into this, even though it's a large part of the book. I didn't get into it today, but part of what I do in the book, when I read all those corporate ads and trade newspapers, and I spent time with folks in industry, I looked at what, kind of like Larissa did and did today, the claims that are being made. And one of the big claims for why farmers ought to adopt these tools, and more importantly, why nation states and supranational organizations like World Bank ought to invest in these tools, is that they're going to feed the world, so growing global population, but also they're going to make agriculture more sustainable. And I think that it is the elephant in the room. You know, if we're talking about food, and especially food production, you can't not talk about climate. So in Canada, 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the food sector. That's including transport, not just production, but that's enormous, right? And so, you know, I really appreciate that attempt, I suppose. But in this paper that's come out, I wanted to really dig in and look for the evidence around the sustainability claim. The other thing is, you know, the claim that's made is that these precision tools will allow for a reduction, right, in chemical inputs, which we know are terrible for the environment, and also the production of agrochemicals. There's a lot of greenhouse gas and emitted there, so fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions. But also they'll reduce greenhouse gases. So like, you know, if the tractor is optimized and its movement through the field is optimized, and the labor driving the tractor is optimized using AI, then farmers can use less, right? Use less fuel, emit less greenhouse gas emissions, and also reduce, you know, harmful inputs for soil, et cetera. So that's the promise. One of the things is I think the evidence is pretty scant, and that's what this paper that I have been doing is looking at. But the other thing is, for me, one of the problems, I think it's a good thing. You know, if we can't just do away with this huge system of global industrial agriculture we've set up over the past 75 years, it can't be undone instantly. And so if farmers of that scale, the corporate industrial farmers, are going to be more judicious in their use of inputs, great, because of AI, that's great. But one concern I have is that still leaves the current system, with all of its environmental justice flaws, including climate justice, right, intact. It still, like, as I talked about before, supports the companies, right, that have really played a heavy role in inequity and environmental justice issues. It supports, you know, a particular mode of agriculture that in and of itself, I think, is unsustainable vis-a-vis climate. So yeah, that would be my.
And if I'm thinking about, you know, because I'm usually coming from the startup lens and like how these companies are really trying to tackle, they are all trying to tackle climate. And to that end, right, they're all going to be required to do an LCA, life cycle assessment. And, you know, particularly looking at carbon, I've looked at cultured meat and whether cultured meat is better than cows. Initially it is, but then it flips because carbon takes longer to dissipate than methane. A lot depends on solar and renewable energy sources. So this like idea that food tech startups will have to come up with LCAs, which are very data intensive, and looking at, you know, like, do you take them for their truth? To what do I believe in what they say, or do I have to like open this 150-page document up and read it to like be able to trust it? I live in California, so drought is a big problem. I think that tools that solve drought, like Kelly mentioned, there are ways that farmers can use less inputs, ways that farmers and particularly vineyards in California can use less water because of, you know, using AI tools or computer vision tools. To me, that seems to be a win, right? But it's only for California, and it's only for wealthy vineyards that can, you know, have access to, you know, buying those tools. You know, vertical farms only promise that they're better for the climate, you know, no pesticides, no pathogens, less water, everything, right? But then you ask them about energy, which is still the big problem, and most of them won't want to talk about that. If they say they're opening up a 100,000 square foot facility, and they'll bring jobs to the location, and you ask how many jobs, and it's like 55 people. So there's they usually focus on the pretty picture, which is how it's better for the climate, but they don't talk about what else it means, what often I will talk about the unintended consequences. And so I think this co-opting AI is also the unintended consequences of big data and reliance on data.
Thank you for that wonderful kicker, Larissa. That was a good one. the journalist in the room. Thank you for that. Before I close this off, Michalis Kritikos has put in the Q&A a report they authored for the European Parliament on precision farming. So there is, this is from 2017, as far as I can see. So there is a little bit of conversation going on, at least on the other side of the big water. With that, we are at time. So I want to close us off by saying thank you so much for this incredibly insightful conversation, for your wonderful contributions. I think it is fair to say that we all have learned a lot. This will most certainly find its way into various classrooms, certainly mine, as well as hopefully policy conversations. Dear audience members who are here with us today and who are watching this later, both Larissa Zimberoff and Kelly Bronson have terrific books out. They are called The Immaculate Conception of Data, Agribusiness Activists and Their Shaped Politics of the Future. This is Kelly's book that is out now. And then we have Larissa's book, Larissa Zimberoff, Technically Food Inside Silicon Valley's Mission to Change What We Eat. Those books should be on your syllabi in your nightstand. Thank you, everybody. This is Co-opting AI for 2022. We're wrapping up. Have a wonderful, restful break. Happy holidays. We will be back in February 2023 with a focus on the pipeline problem, on hiring, and all of these things. So stay tuned for more conversations in the Co-opting AI series. Larissa and Kelly, thank you so much. This is terrific. Have a wonderful rest of your day and hopefully see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.